The long-awaited morning had arrived, but it was still too early to get up and reflect on what was happening. It was necessary to wake up Kabiel, but the boy was sleeping very soundly, and this turned out to be quite difficult. After his name was called repeatedly, he opened his eyes, but it was only an appearance. A few seconds later, he was snoring like a baby again. It was funny on one side, but every coin has a flip side. Here, too, there was no exception. A girl ended up in a book novel and became the main villain. A week before, on an ordinary gray day, our heroine was returning home from another interview. She was lost in thought, but suddenly a sharp cry behind her brought her back to reality, and she turned around. On the road, she saw a boy who had stumbled and was crying, and a huge car was driving towards him. Without thinking twice, she ran and pushed the child out of the way. Suddenly, everything around her turned black. She got scared and thought she was sleeping, but everything was far from true. A board appeared in front of her, saying that the player was dead, and there were two paths to take, judgment or rebirth. But only 10 seconds were allotted for all the manipulations. If you don't have time, the program automatically chooses for you. The girl broke out in a cold sweat. She had nothing left to lose, but she still wanted to live, even if it was in another world. She closed her eyes and poked her finger at random in the last seconds. And when she opened her eyes, she realized that she had become the heroine of a novel that she had already read many times. Kabiel Cernoa is the main character, whose life in the novel was as worthless as that of the reincarnated girl. He is the illegitimate son of the Duke of Cernoa, and was therefore immediately sent to an orphanage. But even there, life dealt him blows. Adults bullied him so much that he began to fear people in general. But a little later, his relationship was confirmed, and since there were no direct heirs, he was returned to the estate. And now he was sleeping so sweetly that one could admire him forever. In the real novel, after the boy was delivered to the estate, Elodie appeared in their house. She was a treacherous villain and also bullied the boy, but they were forced to get married. But soon, Kabiel had to go to war and defend his duchy. It was there, according to the novel, that he met his love, the princess of the kingdom of Dayev. When he returned, he told Elodie everything and demanded a divorce from her. But she didn't agree and tore up the document the guy had prepared. And now she tested her insidious ideas on the princess, and not just on the young man. The girl was an alchemical genius and invented a poison with which she wanted to poison the princess. And now this villain has become a simple girl who wanted to save a boy on the road, but was reborn as the heroine of a novel. But Kabiel found out about her plans before she put them into action and drove her out of the estate. And Elodie fell ill with an illness similar to the effects of poison and soon died alone and in some slums. And now, a new heroine of the novel and new twists of fate are possible. The first thing she needed to do was try to wake up Kabiel. So using all her cunning, the girl began to whisper. And finally, the result was achieved. The boy stood up, but could not yet fully open his eyes. Elodie wished him good morning, her eyes full of joy and tenderness. She gently ruffled the guy's hair and said that he needed to have breakfast. The boy was not very willing to listen to the girl, and this made her a little nervous. But she tried to control herself. They spent the whole day together, and the boy didn't move a step anywhere. And when night fell, the young Countess Elodie decided to make a plan for her life. She now knew some of the peculiarities of her life, based on the novel she had read, and she wanted to live longer than in the book. The first thing that worried her was the problem with the land, which could become completely unsuitable for cultivation. She understood that the county's territory was large enough, which meant that the land could be profitable. The moment when Elodie's body became immobile due to illness was frightening, but it gave hope that a cure needed to be sought in poisons. The girl's eyes filled with fire. She had a great desire to live and make this life as fulfilling as possible. The next morning, Countess Elodie was given the report documents. She was busy with the affairs of the estate. Norman, who had managed the Cernoa house for many years, was one of the first to receive the Countess upon Kabiel's return. But he was very surprised by the literacy of the young lady, since her family was far from rich and did not know how to manage finances. Count Maclair, the only one who agreed to this marriage with the polished son, since his family needed money, simply sold his daughter. The previous owners of the estate were drunkards. They simply squandered most of the money and then died of drunkenness. Then there was another distant relative who laid claim to the lands, but this too was unsuccessful. After some time, Another man appeared in the novel, but he was mentioned in passing. They all tried to mock Kabiel. While rereading the pile of papers that were handed to her, the girl's thoughts involuntarily turned to memories of some important events. House Cernoa was a very powerful duchy long before the war began, and the founder of this family, a distant ancestor, who, according to the novel, was Kabiel's grandfather, was a very important person. The coin vault was mentioned more than once in the novel, and this is the money that they all need so much now. Norman was grateful that Elodie was so attentive to the house and the running of the business. She said that the boy needed a teacher of knightly skills because he was growing up, and it was necessary. Then they went to breakfast. The table was groaning, but Kabiel mostly ate sweets. After breakfast, the Countess and the young man talked. She explained to the boy that he needed training, that he should obey her. Elodie said that when he grows up, he will become big and strong, but for now she is his madam. But she accidentally let it slip that he should do all this only until he meets his princess. The boy listened with his mouth open, and at the moment he did not understand which princess was being talked about. He suddenly asked again with great surprise, but the girl was already running away, trying to play tag with him. Suddenly, the boy caught up with her and said that when he became big and strong, he would definitely hug his madam. At that moment, a tall knight approached the young people and said that he was at Norman's request. He looked at the boy and asked if it was too early for him to learn swordsmanship. He was too young. Since Kabiel had had negative experiences with adults, he immediately hid behind the girl. The girl immediately made it clear that the guy shouldn't speak so arrogantly. It was she who hired him. He apologized, coughed, and said that he forgot to introduce himself. He was Sir Bedos. Then the girl leaned over to Kabiel and said that he would now have training so that he would not be afraid of anything. She showed that she would be nearby on the bench and see everything. And so the lesson began. And in the meantime, Elodie was reading the book with great pleasure. She studied chemistry, poisons, and found herself thinking that she was very interested in all of this and would like to study it in more depth. But the only caveat was that the herbs in question had to be readily available, which meant they had to be grown first. She began to think that in that case, it would be very good to have her own greenhouse and grow everything there. She knew that there was one, but it was in a dilapidated state, and at the moment there was no money to repair it. But then her gaze moved to the training, and the picture angered her. Kabiel sat on the grass and cried, but it was unclear whether he was wounded or whether this crying was from fear. Sir Bedos stood over him and shouted something loudly, which made the situation even worse. Elodie then approached them and said that she had warned them that they needed to behave more gently and not like a soldier. She took Kabiel and said that training was over for today and that there would be a short break for now. Sir Bedos was scolding himself because he had no experience in teaching and did not know how to act correctly. Elodie helped the boy change into his pajamas and could not calmly look at his wounded back. She first noticed his wounds when she was bathing him, and even then she realized that the boy's life in the orphanage was not a bed of roses. But now, due to inexperience and carelessness, he injured his hand. Tears rolled from his small eyes, but he tried to hold on. He looked at the girl, who was trying to handle her as gently as possible, but then she said that crying was not bad, and he could let himself go when he was hurt or sad. She extended her hand and added that he could always rely on her. A smile appeared on his face, and he seemed to forget the sad events of the day. After much conversation and persuasion, Kabiel agreed to treat the wound. And then the girl suggested that they come up with some kind of game so that he could get rid of his fears. Elodie told him to name what the people who did bad things to him looked like, and she would draw them. They spent the evening doing this fun activity and didn't even notice how they fell asleep. A little later, the maid came to check on them and carefully covered them with a blanket. She also noticed the drawing lying nearby and smiled so as not to wake the children. Meanwhile, Elodie was having a dream and saying something very joyfully, with a smile on her face. The next day, they together with Norman found the very same chest with Grandfather Kabiel's money. Both the manager and Elodie herself were very surprised, because the novel did not indicate where exactly he could be found. Norman handed over a neat envelope with an embossed seal. Elodie asked the manager to read the letter, and he was moved to tears by the honor he had been given. While the man was reading, the girl was lost in her thoughts. It said that all this money was going to Kabiel. Elodie said that the money should be invested in strengthening the knightly squad, which is necessary for the future. She happily asked if she could use some of the money for her own benefit, as well as for the needs of the future of the Cernoa house. Strengthening the knightly order is necessary for the upcoming war, which, according to the novel, was too exhausting. The manager also responded satisfactorily to Elodie's personal request. The girl appointed Sir Bedos as the commander of the knightly order, but he did not immediately want to accept this offer. The girl asked why he couldn't accept the offer, since he had neither a wife nor a lover. She looked at Sir intently and crushed him with her gaze. He was shocked by such deep knowledge of his personal life. It meant that he had a lot of free time. In the end, he gave in and said that he was ready to serve faithfully for the good of the House of Cernoa. The next day, at breakfast, Kabiel devoured livers while Elodie read his favorite book. He reasoned that it would be great to live in a house made of sweets, like in the fairy tale that Madame read to him. But she hastened to disappoint him and said that ants love sweets, and living in such a neighborhood is very dangerous. Elodie noticed that her phrase upset the boy very much. She realized even more what he had suffered in the orphanage. But then she asked Kabiel to get up from the table, and he obediently complied with the request. She pulled him by the hand, saying that she had an idea. Elodie placed the boy against the wall and said that she would now measure his height, as she thought he had grown a bit. Then she measured herself and said that from now on, they would do this every year to see how much everyone had grown. And then she said that in the future, he should be strong, handsome, and tall. This is exactly how the author described Kabiel in the novel, before he went off to war. But suddenly, looking into the boy's huge eyes, Elodie laughed. She already saw a handsome man in him. She hugged him tenderly, ruffled his hair slightly, and said that he was very good. Kabiel also hugged Madame, but his hugs were still childish and naive, and Elodie understood that if he went to war, they would not be fought for 10 whole years. And so now she will try to give this young man as many warm memories and emotions as possible. The next day, the manager came to the girl and asked about her birthday. He said that their holidays coincided, and so he took the liberty of combining their party into one day. The girl was very happy and added that she agreed to take part in a real party. Norman laughed and said he was glad to be part of such a bright event in their home. And Elodie wondered what she remembered about her birthdays at all, and what kind of memories they were. But the girl had no good memories from her previous birthdays. Count Mackler never celebrated his children's birthdays, and Elodie generally kept herself apart from everyone. But there is one thing. One birthday, she received a gift from her brother. Before her rebirth, the girl was an orphan, and she had no interest in celebrating her own birthday. It turns out that now she will have her first birthday party. But then Kabiel interrupted her thoughts and asked what kind of day it was that needed to be celebrated. The girl happily replied that this is the day when a person is born. And then she looked at Kabiel with sadness, because she needed to prepare a gift, but she didn't know what to give him. Elodie showed Kabiel a little of the ancient language, and he's doing a great job. The novel said that the swordmaster uses mana to create aura, and the ancient language helps in this. But finally, that birthday party arrived. The table was set, and a huge cake was on. The maids asked the mistress if she liked her new dress, and she showed her joy with great pleasure. The maids congratulated her, wished her the best, and admired the beauty of the young lady. And then one of them brought a huge box for Elodie and put it on the table. The girl solemnly handed the box to Kabiel and said that she had made this gift with her own hands. Opening it, the boy saw a plush bunny that Elodie had made with her own hands, especially for him. He hugged it, and his joy knew no bounds. It seemed as if this toy was the most expensive in the whole world. But then Norman leaned over to the boy and hastened to remind him that it was now his turn to give gifts. And after these words, the boy held out a small box. It looked very touching. She untied the bow, opened the box, and broke into a smile. There were candies and a signed card for her. Enough time passed. Elodie turned 14. Kabiel turned 11. And again, the girl was immersed in the affairs of the Cernoa house. She was reading her reports. Norman came to find out what the orders would be. She only asked what was needed now. During this time, Sir Bedos proved himself an excellent commander-in-chief, and the knightly order gained strength. Even newcomers wanted to join the ranks of knights under his leadership. At the event in honor of the new recruits, Kabiel behaved like a true ruler. Although this was quite difficult for him, she held his hand so that he could feel the support of his family. Elodie decided to find out if it was possible to borrow some funds to repair the greenhouse, Norman replied that the lady had the right to manage the finances and that the repair work would not be too expensive. He clarified that the girl intended to visit the local market today. This was indeed the case, since the purpose of the purchases were herbs that were imported from far away. I wanted to go alone, but Kabiel didn't want to stay alone, so we had to go together. The market was quite crowded and lively. Sir Bedos went with the children to prevent any misfortune from happening. But then suddenly, Elodie's gaze froze on the foreign artists passing by. There were so many of them that it seemed as if they had filled the entire market square. But most of all, the girl noticed that their looks were too angry and sullen. But the crowd quickly passed by, and some interesting aromas came from them. Elodie remembered that, according to the novel, she was interested in perfume and bought herself a bottle. But I chose it without thinking, and it turned out to be a perfume that attracted male attention. This caused too many problems, so this time the girl decided to give up the idea of buying perfume. But suddenly, a crowd of people separated the children again, and the girl began calling for Kabiel. The crowd, in turn, carried him in the other direction. Elodie ran to Sir Bedos and the maid who had gone with them, but no one had seen the boy. Meanwhile, the boy wandered through the streets of the city and talked to himself. But suddenly, he met two tall guys on the way. They recognized him, and he thought that these two wanted to help him and take him to Madame. But it was not to be. One of them grabbed him by the lapels and said that since he was taken into a rich family, he owed them money. The boy closed his eyes and said that he had nothing and called for help with all his might. At that moment, as if by magic, Elodie appeared and called the guy to her. The guys let the boy go, and he ran to the girl and hugged her with all his tenderness. The two smiled and said that they simply grew up together in the same orphanage and wanted to say hello. But then Elodie's eyes filled with such anger that it seemed like she would tear into pieces everyone she came across. But at that moment, Sir Bedos arrived at that place and asked if the children needed help. But at that moment, Elodie grabbed one of the guys by the hair in such a way that they were the ones who needed help. She screamed that he should be flogged with rods for bullying the weak. She screamed so loudly that Bedos didn't think it was necessary to interfere, but said to let the guys go. They ran so fast that only their heels sparkled. But then the girl noticed that there was a strange and beautiful object lying on the ground. When she picked it up, it turned out to be a very antique brooch. Sir Bedos said that the thing looked very expensive, and certainly could not belong to those two guys. At that moment, a foreigner appeared with a question. "I haven't seen two guys. They stole something dear to him from him." The girl showed the brooch and asked if this was the thing the foreigner was looking for. She carefully handed the brooch into his hands. The man burst into tears and said that this was a family heirloom that had been passed down from generation to generation. He then introduced himself as the head of the Rondia Trading Guild and that this brooch was a kind of talisman for him. The girl became thoughtful. Because this acquaintance could be very useful, she immediately introduced Kabiel and said that she was expecting him to visit the Cernoa estate. The head of the Merchant Guild was very surprised when he heard that such a young guy was the head of the house. Night fell, the weather suddenly deteriorated, and there was a heavy downpour. Kabiel slept poorly, tossed and turned, and had a terrible nightmare. In his dream, a creepy man stood in front of him with a rod in his hands and told him that he was destined to be alone. He asked Elodie for forgiveness, knelt before her, and begged her not to leave him. Kabiel asked to explain what he was doing wrong and why everyone was treating him so badly. But the girl in the dream only laughed and said that it was written in his family line to be alone. From this terrible dream, the boy immediately woke up in a cold sweat and noticed that there was no one nearby. He sat down on the bed and looked around, but the room was dark and quiet. Huge tears streamed down his eyes, and for a moment he truly thought he was alone. He quietly, barely audibly, called the lady's name through tears, but the thought that she had abandoned him did not leave him. But then, like a ray of light from the darkness, Elodie appeared with a candle in her hand. She sat down next to the boy on the bed and wiped the tears from his cheeks. Kabiel buried his face in her chest and told her what he saw in his dream. She looked at him with horror and understood that a simple nightmare had scared him to death, and he almost believed in it. He looked at Elodie and, in tears, asked if it was true that she would not leave him and would not go anywhere. The girl hugged the boy tightly and said that it was just a dream, and a very bad one at that. She convinced him that dreams remain dreams and almost never come true, and then she invited him to play shadow theater. She showed various figures against the background of the candle flame, and he guessed who it was. Having lifted the spirits of herself and Kabiel, the girl said that it was time to rest. Elodie fell asleep very quickly, but the boy could not, and so he simply admired his sleeping mistress. There were so many thoughts in his little head that he couldn't sleep. He remembered that the first time she saw the boy, he was crying quietly in the corner. She was very cheerful and talkative, and immediately tried to distract the boy from his bad thoughts. Elodie chattered incessantly, and he himself didn't notice how he stopped crying and listened to her attentively. And now, having returned to these memories, he was able to fall asleep faster. The next day, everyone was a little broken. The lady was completely lost. Kabiel was reading a book. She was full of some thoughts. Her eyes were sad, but she did not share her experiences with anyone. The servants noticed and could not ignore such strange behavior, but they did not know how to help. And then the lady had an idea. She just jumped up from her seat. Everyone went out into the garden together and began to look for something in the grass. They were looking for a certain herb that grows like a weed, but has valuable and useful properties, and they found it. One of the maids decided to try it. They said that the herb had a slightly sour aftertaste. Elodie was again a little lost in her thoughts. Thoughts of poisons and herbs did not leave her. Then they sat down and started chatting with Kabiel and the maid about nothing at all. And then Elodie continued looking for grass in the lawn. She had a plan, but she didn't want to share it with anyone yet. Stujanka looked at the girl's efforts and mentally considered her a bit of a saint. The girl seemed to sense the maid's gaze and looked at her with a mysterious look herself. Previously, magicians shared their knowledge with people, but not everyone wanted to accept it and use it in a good way. On the contrary, some began to prepare poisons and potions to exterminate the weaker ones. But Elodie knew from books that the herb she was looking for had a calming effect and was a pain reliever. Having found another leaf, she began to think that she was missing something, namely greenhouses, so that all herbs could be specially grown and tested in action. And after some time, she finally managed to do what she had planned. She mixed the herbs, tinkered with the proportions, and got an interesting thing. Elodie held in her hands some pills that were supposed to reduce pain and promote faster healing. Now, the most important task remained, to find someone on whom to test these very actions. Coming out into the corridor, Elodie noticed two maids and asked why one of them had been feeling ill the other day. But somehow they got a little scared, and one hesitated and said that she had already taken painkillers and felt better. But another suggested that Madame go to the knight's headquarters, where someone is always injured, because training is going on. And she was right. The boys were training for life and death, just like on the battlefield. Elodie walked with Kabiel, and they looked around. The knights did not greet the young lady very kindly. She laughed and, so that it wouldn't be obvious that she was worried, she simply asked if there were any wounded. Then Lady Sola appeared, greeted them, and said that there was one person who was wounded yesterday. It was Knight Ren, but he didn't really want to take part in the experiments and said that he was doing well. But Lady Sola also wanted to please her mistress and pushed the man from behind, who groaned a little. Elodie handed him a pill and said it would help relieve tension and take away the pain. Before he could swallow it, a girl ran up from behind and asked how he was feeling. Elodie replied that she would be grateful if he shared his feelings later. But the young man himself was surprised. But the effect of the pill was not long in coming, and he really did feel better. The girl was glad. She understood that knights, who are often wounded, are the first to need such medicine. She approached Kabiel and said that in the future this medicine would bring good profit. The boy did not yet fully understand the meaning of such words, but seeing that Madame was happy, he also smiled. Some time passed, and a guest visited Sir Noah's house. The lady was visited by the very head of the trade guild, whose brooch Elodie had found. He was glad to see the girl again, especially since he was traveling to these lands on his own trade matters. And then Elodie decided to offer her guest her new remedy. He took it to examine it with great interest, but he had doubts that it really healed. But Elodie was ready for any questions and explained in full how the pills work. The man asked and asked questions and said that the offer was very interesting, but he had doubts. He looked at the tiny balls in the jar and couldn't believe that such a small thing could help on such a large scale. And then his gaze fell on his own wounded finger. The girl said that he could try it on himself right now. The man simply opened his mouth in surprise, his finger tightening in front of his eyes. He asked what the young lady wanted from him, since she was advertising this product in such a way. The girl didn't make him wait long for an answer. She said that she wanted his guild to take over selling this product. The man said that all this was great, but volumes were needed, and the price would not be affordable to everyone, and he did not want losses. Elodie calmly said that everything else would be her concern, and his question was implementation. Moreover, a sufficient batch has already been produced so that he can take it with him. This medicine is easy to transport and does not require specific temperature conditions. The man listened to everything and said that he would take care of his business and then return to her on the way back. The girl smiled and added that more than one of their trading guilds was passing through. The man understood what the girl was getting at and said he agreed. The young lady immediately handed the contract to the head of the guild. She added that she would sell the drug in large quantities, but the price should be such that ordinary people could buy it. The man listened attentively and was amazed at how smart this young lady was. In the end, everyone was satisfied and they shook hands. But for a moment, the man froze and thought, not letting go of the girl's hand. This behavior alarmed Kabiel, and he looked angrily at the man. The girl noticed the boy's anxiety and laughed, thereby dispelling the situation. She walked up to Kabiel, gently hugged him around the neck, and said that everything was fine, and the boy knew that if she was happy, then he was happy too. The next day, Elodie wanted to go horse riding. She was on a walk accompanied by the Knights Club, namely Lady Solo and Ren. The girl wanted to offer Kabiel a ride on horseback, but then Norman's voice was heard from far away. He was very puzzled. He ran to them and shouted that Count Bologna had come to visit and was waiting for them. This news alarmed Elodie. Sola helped her jump off the horse. The ride was cancelled for today. Count Bologna was a very greedy, cunning man, and ready to make deals with the devil to achieve his goals. Even when the founder of the House of Cernoa was dying, he asked that under no circumstances should the government be entrusted to this count. And now, after some time, this man appeared again. Norman silently accompanied the children to talk to him. Meanwhile, the count himself sat nervously in the living room, waiting. He looked around the room and muttered to himself that this estate should have been his. If these lands were in his power, the whole world would know about him, and his power would have no limits. But at that moment, Kabiel and Elodie appeared in the living room, and despite their excitement, the children tried not to be nervous. Elodie greeted him in the proper manner and smiled politely. The man looked at the children with disdain and did not want to engage in any dialogue at all. Kabiel was very nervous. His large eyes gave him away, but he still greeted the count. Norman served tea. There were sweets on the table, and everyone sat down at the table to talk. Taking a sip, Elodie took the risk of starting a conversation and asked what brought the count to them. He immediately became angry and began to say that they had no right to live here and manage these lands. Naturally, such an angry tone could not help but frighten the children, and for a moment they became quiet. But the count did not relent and continued to insist on his line that they should free his estate. And then Elodie couldn't stand it any longer and began to present arguments against the count himself. She naturally gave a good fight, citing facts she knew from the history of the novel before the Rebirth. Kabiel simply looked at the count in silence with great contempt. And since the count was weak in the verbal duel, he tried to use force. But Elodie managed to shield the guy with her body and said that after such actions, she had every right to forbid him from setting foot on their lands. Calling Norman over, she asked if she had the authority to throw him out. Norman calmly replied that she was the legal owner and had the right to do whatever she wanted. At that moment, the girl and the count's gaze met, and he seemed about to burst with anger. But he was once again told to leave peacefully. Otherwise, he would be escorted out by a knight's escort. For a grown man, it was a great shame to be thrown out by children, but going out under escort was much more frightening. But after a conversation about the lands with the count, Elodie had the idea to travel through these lands. She was riding in a carriage and thinking that if she used all these lands, she could improve her financial situation. The girl observed very beautiful landscapes through the window. The novel gave little indication of how others attempted to manage these lands, but she also remembered that her heroine had a sad end, and she certainly had no time for lands. But Kabiel will mature, but at the initial stage, no one supported him, and this was very suspicious. But at that time, Elodie was on the side of the conspirators, so that's surprising, but now she wants something completely different. In the carriage, Kabiel looked at the girl as if she were a great hope. but she was lost in her thoughts. But Elodie now understood that she had to do everything in her power to ensure that her heir was the best. And so they entered the lands belonging to their county, and the girl opened her mouth from the beauty and power. It was not convenient to travel further in the carriage, so it was suggested to move on horseback. Kabiel doesn't particularly enjoy such trips, but as the future heir, he understood that it was inevitable. And so the two of them rode on horseback and admired the magnificent fields. All around there were beautiful ears of grain, mills were working, and in general, agriculture was flourishing. Kabila's grandfather knew a lot about lands, and it was not for nothing that he conquered them and annexed them to his county. People worked tirelessly and they liked it, because manual labor is the most valuable. It was clear that children were also involved somewhere, but not as slave labor, but according to their abilities. Elodie stroked Kabiel's head and said that in the future, he was obliged to protect and help them all. But then the girl noticed that some of the land was empty. She asked Norman why this was so, since everything could be used, but he replied that this was how the soil was given time to rest. The girl added that turnips could be planted on the empty land, and they would enrich the soil with everything it needed. But she understood that apparently no one had ever delved so deeply into the study of agriculture. She watched as some people communicated during breaks from work and realized that life was going well. But Kabiel didn't understand why the girl kept speaking in riddles about an incomprehensible future. Norman also confirmed that the population has increased recently and people have begun to return to agriculture. And in general, compared to the past in the novel, the county now lives much better, and the lady herself was busy searching for and studying another herb. The greenhouse renovation work was nearing completion, and another goal would soon be achieved. But then the maid came running and brought some strange grass, saying that a lot of it had grown. Elodie was no less surprised, because something new was also a discovery for her. She took the grass and began to examine it. At some point, she seemed quite familiar to her, but she was afraid of being mistaken. She only asked where exactly the maid had found it and how much of it had grown, so that she could study its properties well. But a little later, the girl went down to Kabiel to attend the training, but for the first time, he answered that it was not necessary. And then she realized that the guy was growing up and trying to become independent. She knew that this moment would come sooner or later, but it was quite difficult to accept. But she decided not to burden herself with stupid thoughts anymore, and to enjoy what was happening now. The next day, she read the news from the local newspaper, and that's when she started to panic. There was anxiety and fear in their eyes, because they were talking about that very war. The newspaper wrote that terrible bloody actions were taking place, and innocent people were dying. And behind all this is the emperor himself, who simply wants to show his power and strength over the people. What's even sadder is that Kabiel will be called up for this war and will be gone for 10 years. The maid noticed her mistress's anxiety and asked if everything was okay. She tried to smile, but the maid was quick enough to realize that her mistress was hiding something. There were two sides behind the war, the emperor and the church. One advocated total war without mercy and indiscriminately, but the church was against it. But both sides understood that they were powerless without each other, and in the end, they took the same side, agreeing that they would go together against the Urta Empire. But according to the novel, their strength alone was still not enough. Their strengths were practically equal. It is the troops under the leadership of the competent commander Kabiel that will defeat the enemy. She knew and believed that this guy was capable of a lot, but she didn't want to accept the fact that it would happen very soon. Now, a boy was running in front of her, who knew no worries and rejoiced in simple little things. To hide her worry, the girl immediately put the newspaper down and turned her attention to the guy. She invited him to go for a walk, just to be alone together. The next day, Elodie decided to visit the Count's library to find books about history. Running her gaze over the huge shelves, she finally found an interesting book for herself. It described the story of the first descendant of Cernoa, the same grandfather who left the chest with coins. She greedily read page after page, and the further she went, the more interesting facts there were. There was talk about a very important detail, which was like a talisman in the photo. A brooch was pinned to the chest. Elodie immediately began looking for the secret door in the library to find this valuable thing. She looked through what seemed to her to be every corner, every book and shelf, but there was nothing. Then her gaze fell on the table, because that was how she found the chest with coins. She decided to look under the table. in the last hope of finding something there, at least some kind of clue. She noticed that there was something that looked like a hiding place, applied a little effort and opened it. And a very interesting box opened for her, which was very beautiful. Having opened it, the girl again discovered a lot of coins and some stones. But the most important loot was that very brooch. But suddenly, the screen appeared in front of her again, and she had to make a choice. But now she didn't understand what they were talking about some kind of slowing down life. Once again, a choice had to be made. The countdown was on again, and there was no time to think. Elodie knew she had to take a risk, and she closed her eyes and pressed the button. When the light dissipated, the girl opened her eyes, and in her hands was the same brooch, like new. She decided right away that she would give it to Kabiel, and that this would definitely help him win the war with the least losses. Night fell. The lady fell asleep, and Kabiel looked at her sleepily and was full of thoughts. He couldn't understand why she was saying this now, that he owed them many things in the future, as if she was saying goodbye to them. The boy felt calm only when he was next to his mistress, but her words scared him seriously. Lately, she had been saying a lot of things that made him think. Kabiel continued to look at his sleeping mistress, and still could not connect her words and his thoughts into one. He took her hands, looked at her tenderly with his huge eyes, and tried to fall asleep. But the night flew by quickly, and a new day arrived, which brought many events. The house manager called out to Elodie and Kabiel, and the girl immediately became wary. Norman said with a sad look that a letter had arrived from the Emperor. Kabiel immediately began to read it greedily, but not out loud, but only to himself for now. Elodie tried to get him to tell her what was there, but from the newspaper news, she understood that there was an order for him to go to war. After finishing reading the letter, the boy asked himself only one question: why him, when he was so young? He immediately rushed into the arms of the lady, hoping to find an answer, but her words touched him even more and brought him to tears. The first thing was that he did not want to part with Elodie, but the day finally came, and only a couple of days were allotted for preparations. As she said goodbye to her young husband, she said she had a small gift. She handed him that very brooch and said that this thing would protect him in the war. The only thing she asked was that she not take it off under any circumstances. Sir Beto stood nearby, along with a maid, who wiped away tears and said she would miss him. And then Elodie added a note and said that she could and should read it when she felt the need. Sir Betos came up and said that it was time to set out. The road ahead was long. The road will really not be easy along a rocky path, and so everyone sat down on the horse. But Kabiel did not even want to turn around, because he understood that he would be upset. Elodie silently watched the departing soldiers. She knew that the separation would last 10 years. Meanwhile, spring was already approaching. Elodie became fully immersed in the study of herbs and their practical applications. In the greenhouse, together with the maid, they monitored the growth of new shoots. At one time, the church shared its magical powers and knowledge, but not everyone wanted to delve into it. And now the lady was worried about the new ginseng root, which began to grow abundantly. But her thoughts were somewhere far away. She wanted to know what was happening to Kabiel and what she was preparing for. Norman came to her with more reports, since at the moment she was considered the head of the Cernoa house. But suddenly, the girl became interested in the topic of slums, because according to the manager, poverty still flourishes there. Elodie asked if she was right that the slums were part of their land. Norman agreed. She remembered how often Kabiel had nightmares about the orphanage where he grew up. Norman said that this orphanage is still operating, and then Elodie said that it was high time to go there and see what was going on. She added that she remained silent out of respect for Count Bologna, and after his last visit, there was no point in waiting any longer. As she was getting into the carriage, one of the knights of the order presented her with a bouquet. It was so sweet. The flowers were so beautiful that the girl stood still for a moment, admiring them. Just recently, her young husband brought her such flowers. She missed him very much, and these flowers made her even sadder. A little later, the lady reached that very shelter. A nondescript man came out to meet them, and Norman, and asked what they had come for. Elodie immediately asked to invite the most important person in this establishment for a conversation. But when they went inside to wait, the lady's face was covered with panic horror at what she saw. The children were very exhausted, looked dirty and tired. Norman said that the situation was not so dire before. The man came out and said that the owner of the orphanage was busy, and they could choose a child for now. But Elodie insisted on her own. she said in a rather demanding voice that she wanted to see the management. And at that moment, a rather impressive woman entered the room. Seeing her luxurious outfit, Elodie rushed to her and asked if she remembered the boy they beat. The woman said in surprise that they had many children, and she could not remember them all. But then the young lady handed over the drawing that Kabiel had drawn, and the faces were similar. The woman immediately began to change the subject and say that no one is tortured unless they are punished for a reason. But Elodie insisted that children don't draw such pictures out of fear. The child was frightened. Here, attention switched to the man who met them upon arrival. He couldn't say anything coherent at all. But everything was clear anyway, because these two looked 100 times better than all the children. But out of fear, the man said that he was only following orders, which terribly angered the owner. Then the knights arrived, they tied up these bandits and had to punish them. Elodie herself was as happy as a child that everything had been resolved, and she had avenged Kabiel. When the lady went outside, there were children all around. They were like blind kittens. When asked what would happen to them, she answered without thinking twice that a new orphanage needed to be built. In the new, better conditions, the children will be happy and everyone will be content. She approached the knight and thanked Brian for his help. He said he was happy to serve and had only done his job. Elodie turned to Norman and said proudly that there would be no more slums and poverty. Norman was literally moved to tears because such a young girl was able to so easily resolve issues that had existed for years. Yes, she was young, but no one knew that she was much smarter than the Elodie described by the author of the novel. Meanwhile, somewhere in the camp of the Knightly Detachment, Kabiel decided to open the letter his wife had written to him. There was so much tenderness and warmth in it that while reading it, the guy's tears started flowing on their own. He really missed that home environment. Meanwhile, the rest of the knights were exploring the forest. Evil spirits lurked among the branches. They waited for the right moment and attacked. But the knights were also expecting a trick and were ready to attack, and they repelled the attack very clearly and quickly. The saddened Kabiel was also nearby. But up to this point, he had never had to fight. He was a little scared, confused, and after the letter, also upset. But as soon as he saw the monster above him, all his fears immediately disappeared. He swung his sword quickly and accurately and cut the monster in half. After all this, his hands were shaking. The senior knights asked how he was, but the guy did not show any sign of being scared. He was slightly injured, and they were worried about him, even though he was supposed to lead the squad himself. Sometime later, in the camp where the soldiers were resting, Kabiel was wiping his sword after the battles when Sir Therion entered. He offered him painkillers, which Mrs. Elodie herself had given him. For a moment, Kabiel froze, because he had not spoken this name for so long and had not heard any news. He said he felt fine and generally wanted to practice fencing. Sir Therion was surprised, because he had just been in a fight and needed to rest. But the guy didn't listen and went outside to train. He remembered that people always laughed at him behind his back, but he had to become strong. Nobody believed in him, they tried to offend him. But Elodie always instilled in him faith in himself and confidence in his abilities. And now he heard a familiar voice. Therion came up and called out to the guy several times. He said that he was too tired, and there was no point in exhausting himself. But the boy asked if Sir had called him before. The question was strange, but the voice also disappeared. Night fell in the camp. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, and everyone was resting peacefully. Kabiel was sleeping peacefully in his separate tent, and now he had another nightmare. He dreamed of the mockery of other knights. He must lead them to war. He tossed and turned and couldn't fall asleep. Their words repeated in his head like a spell. Unable to bear it, he got up and sat on the bed, his thoughts not leaving him. But suddenly, he heard a voice again and touched his brooch, because the voice sounded like Elodie's. He himself did not believe that the brooch could speak, but it responded to his thoughts. He took it in his hands and asked if this was possible. The brooch immediately answered that he knew who gave it to him. Naturally, his young wife personally put this brooch on him, and she breathed this power into it. And then the brooch continued that only a true descendant can hear this voice. Once upon a time, the spirit of fire made a deal with a man, and they both benefited from it. The boy clutched the sheet in frustration to hide his anger. The next morning, Kabiel set off for another training session with renewed vigor. But thoughts about what he heard that night did not leave him, and the brooch tried to start a conversation again. The guy didn't immediately realize that the brooch was reading his thoughts. and that he couldn't hide anything. He wanted help, but he was afraid of the unknown, and he remembered Elodie's words that strangers were dangerous. The Spirit of Fire would also have benefited from this deal, since enrichment with power is important in two directions. Kabiel was very doubtful. Even questions about his wife and returning home did not convince him. But the boy wanted to be sure that this alliance would really help him win the war and become stronger. He thought for some reason, and his thoughts materialized. The Spirit of Fire approached him, and the boy was able to touch him. They felt each other's strength. In the evening, he finally decided to make a deal with the spirit. But the fear remained. He wrote something down on paper and said that he was ready. The brooch cast a spell and said that it was necessary to make an appeal to Ifrit, the Spirit of Fire, the King of Spirits. The boy stretched out his hand and said everything that the brooch commanded, and a bright light appeared in the tent. After the light dissipated, a strange little animal appeared. Kabiel was shocked at how this fluffy little ball could give him strength. The animal greeted its new owner and said that there was no need to rush to conclusions. He added that their agreement would help him take on his appearance, and the boy would receive his share of the power. Meanwhile, Elodie was visiting children in the new orphanage that had been built to replace the building in the slums. She was there with her maid, who was also happy like a child and played with the children. This way, Elodie could distract herself and not think about Kabiel and the war in general. One of the pupils approached her and said that she was glad that the mistress had visited, and in gratitude, she gave her a flower. Happy Elodie walked to the carriage and inhaled the scent of the gifted flower. But then suddenly she felt weak and numb. The symptoms were the same as in the novel, when the heroine died. But the timing was too early. Returning home, Elodie immediately went to her greenhouse and began collecting herbs. She began to intensively study books and the possibility of curing symptoms such as hers. She hoped to greet her husband with a smile. But everything doesn't go according to plan. The lady spent all the following days in the greenhouse and laboratory. She was puzzled and saddened, wary and acting rather cautiously. When the servants addressed her, she would force a smile and say that everything was fine with her. But when she was alone, she became sad again. One day, the girl noticed that a new herb had appeared. Even the maid noticed this, because the greenhouse was visited quite often, and no one had noticed anything new before. Elodie immediately decided to test the properties of this herb on herself. She brewed 2 cups of tea from the leaves and flowers of this herb. At first, she decided to try tea made from leaves. It was not very strong and not very rich in color. After she swallowed the tea, she felt nothing. But after a few minutes, she began to feel her fingers again. They weren't made of stone. The next one was a cup of flower tea, but it scared the girl because the color was too intense. Before she could swallow the first sip, the mug of tea fell out of her hands. She herself almost fell down from the cough that began to overwhelm her. But then she also noticed that there was blood on her hands when she covered her mouth. And eventually, she felt complete relief when the cough stopped. She concluded that these 2 decoctions complemented each other's effects. But coughing up blood frightened her. She made the decision not to say a word to any of the servants. Her mood changed. She calmed down, because the medicine turned out to be easier to find than she thought. The servant girls also noticed that a slight smile appeared on the mistress's face, but they were worried. Somewhere deep down, they were very worried, but they tried not to show it. But one girl stayed to clean the mistress's office. She was in a good mood. But then she approached the table and saw that Elodie had forgotten her handkerchief, hidden from view. When the girl pulled out the handkerchief, she was horrified that it was covered in blood. There was peace and quiet in the camp during the war at that time. Kabiel discussed the next steps with his knights. Enough time passed, and he no longer looked like that boy who was afraid of everything. But the knights did not agree with his opinion, since the events that happened the day before were to blame for everything. He believed the words of the girl who introduced herself as a princess. Meanwhile, the war was in full swing, and the emperor stopped at nothing. The emperor and the church were in constant struggle with each other, and it was only a matter of power. The church could provide magical warriors, and that was exactly what the emperor needed. But the purpose was not what Kabiel thought. Having finally understood the intentions of the war, he realized that he needed to change tactics and destroy the Orta Empire. But the Spirit of Fire calmed the guy and said that he needed to wait just a little longer, and the war would end. Ifrit asked if he really didn't want to go to his wife. After all this time apart, the guy thought about it, because many people here are lonely, and they are waiting for him there. but there have been no letters for a long time, and he knows nothing about his wife. He heard whispers about the knight's wife, that she had abandoned him, and he still knew nothing. But he doesn't receive any more news, only that single first letter. Maybe Elodie has already married someone else, and he is here worrying about her and what is happening to her. He felt sad. He didn't want to trust the spirit anymore, or rather, at the moment, he didn't have the strength. He asked his little friend to leave that evening. The spirit left, but he could hear thoughts, and said that, having grown up, he had changed too much and could be aggressive. And it was at that very moment, left alone with himself, that he heard some voices. And after a while, out of the blue, a girl fell on him. Everyone was very distrustful of her, and tried to convince Kabiel that this could be the work of the enemy. She introduced herself as a princess, and said that Haikar II, the king of Urta, was hunting her. One of the knights dared to ask how she managed to open the gate and get to them. The girl extended her hand and said that this bracelet was given to her by her mother, and that it had magical powers. She burst into tears and said that she did not want to become a slave, and that none of her relatives were alive anymore. Kabiel said that tomorrow they would see if she was right or not. The knight, who doubted the actions of the chief, remained to wait. As he left, he added that if something went wrong, he would allow the princess to be killed. In the meantime, he will check whether the king will really come for her, and this will be an opportunity to settle scores. The next day, Kabiel himself went to the place indicated by the princess. Having killed the guards, he began to wait for his main rival. He didn't have to wait long. He didn't expect to see a strange knight. The man immediately pounced with questions and threats. But Kabiel did not stand on ceremony for long. One swing of the sword, and the deed was done. And then he ordered the spirit of fire to roast everything here until it was completely destroyed. And so it came to pass that Kabiel led the war, and wherever he set foot, everything burned to the ground. Step by step, he walked towards victory, as promised to him by the King of Spirits. The residents rejoiced. The war was over. Elodie read the news and couldn't believe it. Events were developing completely differently from the novel she knew. But the most important thing has happened, and unfortunately, there is no escape from it. Kabiel met a princess during the war, which means they will be together, and now she has to leave. Her role in his life had come to an end. She only wanted to hope that he would allow her to live somewhere on the outskirts. Meanwhile, back in the camp, there was a debate about whether to go to the emperor. The knight was surprised that Kabiel, as commander-in-chief, refused the emperor's personal gratitude. He replied that he wanted to return home quickly. He was tired of being away for so long. But what was also troubling was that the Prince of Zendikar had disappeared without a trace near the lands of La Plencia. But the Spirit of Fire can find someone whose face remains clearly in memory, but otherwise everything is useless. During this war, many mysterious things happened. His growing up, the princess, her bracelet. As it turned out, this item was stolen from the church. The princess, having learned of this, gave it to him as a gift and said that he should continue to be of use where he had been before. For some reason, everyone attributed the affair to the princess and Kabiel. Although he had a wife, he looked in the mirror and again thought about how his wife would accept him. So much time had passed. The little friend tried to joke that she should remember him anyway, no matter what his build became. But Kabiel did not like his new friend very much now, and was surprised that he had become small again. The spirit answered him that due to the excess of power, he could now change his appearance, but his thoughts were already far away. Meanwhile, Elodie met Sir Bedos and was very happy to meet him. They chatted. She asked how things were in general. He was a little embarrassed. Elodie praised him for his successful command and for the victory that everyone was expecting. But the conversation did not last long. The girl said that it was time for her to go and hurried away. Arriving in her chambers, she immediately fell exhausted onto the bed. Her head was full of thoughts. She felt downright deathly tired. She didn't understand why the princess was considered the king's niece, as she and Kabiel were. She was very afraid of how the meeting would go after separation, and she was sure that there was no place for her in her husband's life. And then the very day of return came. The servants bustled about under Norman's direction, and Elodie, in her chambers, was getting ready and preparing for the first meeting after separation. Norman entered the chambers and said that it was time to go out. The knights were already arriving. Elodie was very tense with excitement. She didn't know what to say or how to behave. And then horses appeared at the gate. The first to ride on horseback was Kabiel. He was wearing a beautiful suit, stately and tall. He immediately walked up to Elodie and looked into her eyes for a long time, and then followed a tender, strong embrace. There was a feeling that he could crush the fragile lady. She didn't expect such tenderness because she was preparing for a completely different outcome, and the knights in the crowd whispered like young ladies about how they didn't recognize their commander. They gossiped about how Elodie was like a sister to him, not a wife at all, and that she was incapable of melting his heart. Everyone kept saying that he couldn't find a better match than a princess, but seeing how tender he was with his mistress, they were confused, although they believed that she was only wasting his fortune here. The servants also shed bitter tears, as if he had not returned now, but was just leaving for the war. Earlier, Norman had gathered everyone to talk about Elodie's illness and agree on further actions. He said that she hid it for a long time, and if it weren't for the incident with the scarf, no one would have found out anything. But he also added that they should not pretend to know everything, but help from afar. Kabiel was immensely glad to meet him, but somehow the lady's gaze seemed indifferent to him. He asked what was wrong, why she was silent, and didn't say how glad she was to see him. Kabiel took her hands and hugged them tenderly, saying that it was like he was back in the good old days. He touched his face with his hands and continued to say a bunch of compliments. She also looked at her husband and wanted to reciprocate, but she was afraid. She turned around and said that it was time to go and rest. Everyone was tired from the journey. Kabiel stood there, confused. He didn't understand why the lady was so cold. Elodie herself was unsure of the correctness of her actions, but she did not want to deviate from her tactics. They entered the bedroom where they spent time as children. Kabiel noticed that nothing had changed. The lady said that she had not touched anything since he left. He praised that the estate was very clean and beautiful. To ease her excitement, Elodie said that he had also become a very handsome young man, and she simply hadn't expected it. Once again, Kabiel tried to get closer to the lady, and once again asked if she was glad to return. He looked intently into her eyes, wanting to see the answer in her gaze, but she turned away again and said that she, of course, missed him and waited, and was very glad that he returned healthy. The guy didn't understand at all what was happening. The thought occurred to him that she had someone else, but he didn't have the strength to ask, and he was afraid, and it was also difficult for him to be in an incomprehensible state. After a while, they changed clothes and went to dinner, but the tension in the air continued even at the table. Elodie ate slowly and was lost in her thoughts about when her husband would tell her about the divorce. But he just looked at her and couldn't stop admiring her and couldn't think of anything else. He couldn't get enough food. Everything seemed so familiar, but at the same time so far away. But Elodie kept wondering when the conversation about divorce would begin. She was already ready to say goodbye to her husband, but everything was going wrong. After dinner, the two of them walked along the corridors of the estate to their bedrooms. And when they approached the door, the girl immediately mentioned that she was spending the night in the room next to him. Her thoughts had already said that this is how it would be now until they got divorced, but out loud, she simply told him to rest. The young man's gaze made it clear that he was perplexed, and that her words were incomprehensible to him. He asked his question again, that she was not happy to see him, and his presence nearby was also unpleasant. But the girl insisted on her own, saying that she was not used to seeing him like this, but was very happy. In Kabiel's eyes, despite his height, one could see a childish fear that he would be left alone. He turned silently and headed towards his bedroom. The girl went after him. She felt guilty, but knowing the history of the affair, she didn't know what to do. He was still the same young husband she had protected and loved, but now he had become much better. She tried to touch his shoulder, but something inside prevented her, and he glanced sideways at his wife, guessing. Kabiel said that it was she who taught him that husband and wife spend the night together, and he does not understand her refusal. She tried to defuse the situation, and said that after such a long period of fighting, he simply needed to rest. Elodie suddenly beamed and said that she had no intention of leaving her husband, but now they just needed to get used to each other. From such words, Kabiel became darker than a cloud. Inside him there still lived like that boy, who was afraid of everything new. And Elodie, giggling, tried to change the subject to something more pleasant. But in this situation, the conversation didn't seem to go well, and Kabiel remained silent, trying to listen to every word. Elodie herself was waiting for this day, and really wanted it, but she was sure that her husband didn't need her, and now he won't let her go. He was more gentle and affectionate than ever. He touched her face. He wanted to enjoy every moment of her presence. Here his face broke into a gentle smile when the lady invited him to remember the past. She led him to the wall and showed him how she had measured his height year after year until he went off to war. He looked at these colored stripes and noticed that Elodie had already marked her height at approximately the same place as she is now. Kabiel asked why she did that. She replied that she was bored and decided to imagine what she would be like. But she didn't expect him to grow so much and suggested measuring his height now. Of course, he agreed with pleasure. It was a reason to keep his wife nearby. But then he asked her again to stay with him, at least for one night. And that's how it happened that they both fell asleep. Elodie fell into a sweet sleep because she was very worried, and the young man, as always, felt protected and slept like a baby. But at some point, Elodie opened her eyes. She looked at the guy and was happy, but she didn't know for how long. Kabiel really wanted to hug his wife, but he could only imagine it in a dream because of recent events. He woke up much earlier and was very worried. Kabiel carefully covered his wife so as not to disturb her sleep. Meanwhile, he went to wash himself and drink some water. When he returned and approached the bed, he was very surprised. On the pillow sat his little furry friend, with whom he had made an agreement. Kabiel immediately began to drive him away, but the spirit replied that he had only come to look at the one who had given him life. He hastened to remind that it was this girl who activated the brooch and gave it to Kabiel. But then he added that the guy became too angry when he had fully gained strength and ran away. And Kabiel again lay down next to his wife to prolong the moments of being together. After a while, Elodie herself woke up. She also looked at her husband with love and was glad in her heart that he was nearby. It was time to take a stroll around the city, and Elodie hurried to change. She was grateful to her husband for being polite and going out while she needed to change her dress. There was a maid in the chambers, and the girl was again in the clouds. And then Elodie asked what happened between the girl and the knight. At first, the maid didn't understand what they were talking about, because there had been no quarrel. And then she remembered her conversation, and laughing said that it was nothing serious. Having calmed the lady down, she understood that she could not tell her about that conversation. And the matter was as follows, and this was truly a secret that could not be disclosed. On the day the knights returned home, the maid was talking to Sir. He praised the princess and said that she was the best match for Kabiel. The man insisted that if the lady and the guy himself loved each other, then they were brother and sister. But the maid insisted that they were right for each other, because they had known each other for a long time. Beto said that the lady loved the young man's condition, and not him as a person. These words touched the maid very much, because she was there every day when they left for the war. The man did not know how to calm the girl down. She presented arguments in defense of the mistress, but then she gathered her courage and gave him a hard slap. The man immediately fell to his knees and began to ask forgiveness for his thoughtless words. But the maid was unwilling. She knew that her mistress did not sleep at night and worked very hard. Meanwhile, the city was celebrating the end of the war. Elodie suggested that Kabiel take a walk and see how the city had changed. She looked completely different today, somehow especially elegant. Kabiel said that he would definitely keep his wife company, and so they went for a walk along the streets. The lady pointed out a very interesting place. It was a store that sold various jewelry, and they were greeted by a very polite salesperson. Kabiel noticed an interesting hairpin and immediately applied it to his wife's hair. Even the saleswoman noticed that the item was chosen with taste and suited the girl very well. They bought it, and the girl behind the counter said that they looked very harmonious. After leaving the store, the girl thanked him for the gift. She was proud to be the wife of such a noble knight, but deep down, she was still haunted by the story she knew. While walking with Kabiel, she decided for herself that she would live these days as she felt, since history was not going quite that way. And then she offered to look at her greenhouse and laboratory, which she had created in her absence. They met Sir in the corridor. He looked rather puzzled. Elodie asked if everything was okay and thanked him for his good service. But then she saw blood on him and offered him her handkerchief. He was scared. They wished him well and moved on. Sir watched them go, thinking about the words the maid had said to him. They did look very nice, but Kabiel was different from what he was in the war, and so they reached that very greenhouse that Elodie had talked so much about. Kabiel admired the work done. He said that everything here is much more beautiful now. She walked through each area and told us what was growing where. They approached the very same herb that the lady herself had recently found and studied. Kabiel asked her with interest about how she was working with herbs and remembered that it was time to drink the infusion. And then they came to her most important brainchild. She said that this is her most important achievement. The guy asked what was so special about it, and she looked at him with incomprehension. Their eyes met, and they looked at each other in a completely different way. But then the girl said that she told him everything in letters and sent him pills from this herb. But Kabiel said sadly that he had received nothing. He only had one single letter. She took it and said that she personally gave him this letter before leaving for the war. Elodie thought for a moment, because she didn't understand how this could have happened. Kabiel noticed that the words about the letters upset the lady, and he wanted to say something, but did not know what. He simply took the girl's hand and kissed it tenderly. Her face changed dramatically. She began to smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Kabiel looked at her and for a moment could not say anything. And then he added that she taught him that husband and wife should share, so he gave her a good mood. But Elodie still wanted to say that they should get divorced, and she was ready to accept this fact. But then she asked Kabiel to give her his hand. He did not understand what was happening. She took his hand and came closer. Looking into his eyes, she decided that she would do everything to live happily. But their short idyll was interrupted by the maid Marie, who came running with a very agitated look. She said that a letter had arrived from the temple, and this news alarmed everyone. Kabiel suddenly became very worried that the temple suddenly needed it. The war was over. Returning to her office, Elodie read the letter and understood that the church wanted to emerge from the shadows after its victory. It was now, when Kabiel had led to victory, that they decided to announce the visit with gratitude to the young ruler. The Temple of Tisir had great influence, and there were small parishes everywhere. But after the victory, for some reason, it became empty. And now they will try to lure Kabiel to their side, because he has become quite strong. She understood that the story was going as she had once read it, but not in the right order, and that made her feel uneasy. As she read the letter, she became even more immersed in her thoughts and realized that many things did not depend on her, and she was even more worried about the fact that the princess had arrived and that she would be completely out of place. But the letter said that the church representatives wished to visit the young ruler and nothing more. But according to all laws, if the union was concluded in childhood, then upon reaching adulthood, confirmation from the church is required. And as Elodie noted, her husband doesn't intend to talk about this topic at all. He was also diligently studying the documents, or perhaps his thoughts were occupied with something or someone else. One way or another, everyone in the estate was waiting for the princess's arrival, but it weighed most heavily on the lady. A little later, Sir Bedos was in the courtyard, and the young ruler called out to him. He was angry enough that Sir quickly walked towards him. Kabiel immediately asked in a commanding voice where the handkerchief that Milady had given him was. The knight immediately, and without hesitation, handed the stranger's thing to its owner. But Kabiel did not stop and continued to scold, saying that the absence of war is not a reason to forget about good manners. He glared angrily at the guy and was about to leave to go about his business. Sir Bedos, watching him go, praised himself for the thought that he did not recognize Kabiel at all. Many people were still gossiping about various things on the battlefield, but now there is a dinner in honor of the victory, and all the knights need to be united. But those who actually fought are set against others who were next to the lady and did not risk their lives. And so the dinner came in honor of the victory, and immediately the knights began to express their dissatisfaction. Kabiel understood perfectly well what the occasion was, since there were people at the table whom he had not invited at all. On the other side of the table sat the Vassals, who initially did not support either Kabiel or his wife. Baron Garcia was generally on the side of Mr. Bologna, and he hoped that the young ruler would not return from the war. He made a deal with the Baron and hoped that after the war, all the lands would go to him. A few days before the festive dinner, all the Vassals gathered at one table to decide what to do. One of the Vassals said that they had been removed from office by another ruler and that Kabiel had nothing to do with it. Baron Garcia was sure that if they came to dinner, they would have a chance, because not everyone had to fight. Baron Bernard decided to speak first and ask to be heard, because everyone has the right to a second chance. Kabiel was very angry and said that now was not the place or time, And secondly, he personally did not invite anyone. He continued that his wife had prepared the dinner, and now they were trying to show complete disrespect. The Baron lowered his head guiltily and fell silent, but inside, he had hoped that something would change. The ruler was categorical and wanted to drive out the Baron and the rest of the vassals. But then Milady intervened, and she placed her hand on Kabiel's knee to calm his temper. He did not expect this and fell silent from this action and turned towards his wife. She looked into his eyes with her piercing gaze. At the tables, the knights whispered that the holiday would likely be ruined. My lady also glanced at all the vassals. Her gaze was quite bold. She knew from the novel, and so they did not support Kabiel from the beginning and were against him since childhood. And now she was waiting for them to appear, but she was sure that he would not be so impudent and tactless. Kabiel held his wife's hand and was not going to let go. He felt support and the opportunity to be closer. But the lady could not restrain herself, and, raising her tone, said that it was neither the time nor the place, but they could at least apologize. The vassals were happy with this turn of events. Now they understood that there was a chance to move forward. After the dinner party, the lady was supposed to have a conversation with the Baron, and she was very worried. Baron Bernard was quite influential, but what exactly brought him to talk to her remained a mystery. He sat proudly in the chair and immediately declared that he did not consider Elodie the ruler's wife, and suggested that she get a divorce as soon as possible. She was shocked by this turn of events, and didn't even know what to answer. But the Baron was serious, and it was clear from his appearance that he would not accept any arguments. A few days before, he met with Baron Garcia, and they had a very businesslike conversation. Barnard expressed all his wishes that he considers wrong regarding the current mistress. He said that the daughter of a greedy duke should not be involved in the country, and moreover, he had no interest in the war. Baron Garcia said in passing that Bernard had a granddaughter, and she could well suit Kabiel much better. And so, referring to this conversation, the Baron continued to convince the girl that she had no place next to the ruler. She listened to this in silence, and at first did not attach much importance to his words. But when he began to speak openly about his granddaughter, Elodie couldn't stand it any longer, and said that for more than 10 years, the fate of the ruler had not mattered to him. But now he was worried. The Baron didn't expect such a reaction from the girl, but she didn't calm down and said that if there were changes, it wasn't up to him to decide. She added that there is already a successor, and this is Princess Larissa, who is the Emperor's niece. Then she continued more firmly, saying that it was definitely not up to him to decide who had the right to be a duchess and who did not. That his granddaughter could hardly be better than the princess, and certainly not in these lands. Her eyes filled with anger and hatred. She was ready to leave the stage, but certainly not for the benefit of her husband's enemies. Baron Bernard coughed, but he did not want to give in so easily, and the arguments about the princess, who had not even arrived, did not frighten him at all. There was silence in the air, but Elodie's gaze seemed to flash lightning. The Baron tried to upset the girl in every possible way, and sometimes she thought that she had almost lost. But she also said to her friend that if the Baron did not want to be removed from the estate in disgrace, he would be better off leaving himself. At that moment, Kabiel entered the room, looking furious. He immediately asked who gave the Baron the right to decide who was suitable or not for the role of his wife and duchess. Kabiel grabbed the sword that hung on his belt and was ready to pierce the boron. He sat down on the floor from surprise and a slight push, and was confused. But Elodie quickly tried to calm her husband down and convince him that their conversation was definitely not worthy of a mortal fight. She said that the man himself realized that he had said too much and was already getting ready to leave. Her gaze showed concern, but not so much for herself, but for her husband and his position in society. At that moment, a knight ran into the room, asking what the noise was about. The picture was rather strange. Elodie and Kabiel were standing, and a little further away from them on the floor sat the frightened Baron. She tenderly hugged her husband and said that nothing terrible had happened. Everything was fine now. Then she approached the Baron and asked if everything was okay with him and if he had been hurt in the fall. Kabiel looked menacingly at the Baron, but said nothing. His eyes said everything. The knight was confused, because he did not understand who was to blame in this situation. And for him, my lady looked like the instigator of the conflict. The Baron left, and Kabiel told his subordinate that he could go free. And then, when they were alone, Elodie said that her husband had done it in vain. His order was not entirely correct from a legal point of view. He should not decide such issues without a trial, and if he killed a vassal, he could also be convicted, and this would ruin his reputation. He nodded obediently and said that he completely agreed that he had acted rashly, but he was protecting his wife. Kabiel looked at his wife again with hope and was sure that this situation should bring them closer together. They held hands like lovebirds, and the lady thanked her husband for his attention and concern. Kabiel promised that he would not do this again and would try to seek advice in the future. The girl smiled, but she was tormented by the thought that there was truth in today's words and that she would soon be out of luck. But for now, she wants to enjoy such moments and look at her husband in love with her. The next day, Kabiel called Baron Bernard to her office. He was no longer the boy everyone was used to seeing. He was a young but serious ruler. He looked at the Baron and said that yesterday's meeting had disappointed him, but he remembers that the Baron wants to serve him faithfully and truly, and is ready to prove it with his service. The Baron happily said that it was all true, and he was ready to prove his complete loyalty. Kabiel was reserved, and continued that the opportunity to prove it would soon arise. It was precisely in the dark forest that cases of monster attacks became more frequent. Now he will have some rest and go off to write and compile reports on work, and he will see how easy it is to be in charge. After all, the Baron believes that Elodie did nothing while her husband was at war, and she did a lot of work during this time alone. Therefore, Kabiel confidently stated that the Baron could cope just as well. But the Baron immediately fell to his knees before the ruler and said that he had only recently returned to his family, and he himself thought that the lady had drugged Kabiel with a potion, which made him so uncooperative. But Kabiel added that since the Baron was worried about his family, they could go with him. Sometime later, somewhere in the estate, a charming girl named Iris was walking, who was the granddaughter of that very Baron Bernard. She was lost in thought about how, after talking to her, the young ruler remained indifferent, but she remembered that her grandfather had promised that everything would be as she wanted, so she wasn't too worried. Suddenly, she noticed a rose bush. Flowers always attracted her, and pink roses especially. It was with this color that she had an association when a certain young man helped her. His pink hair sank into her soul. She thought about it. The flowers brought back memories, but suddenly Elodie greeted her, and this frightened and angered the girl at the same time. The lady apologized guiltily. She had in no way wanted to frighten the girl. Elodie asked if the young lady knew Iris and complimented her on how the pink dress suited her very well. But the girl also didn't quite understand who she was talking to and answered reluctantly, but didn't admit that she was Iris. When Elodie said that she had business to attend to and had to leave, she stuck her tongue out at her and assumed that she was a lady-in-waiting. Meanwhile, Baron Garcia received a letter saying that he would need to go to the dark forest, and somewhere in the corridor, Count Bernard was met by his assistant, who said that he could no longer withstand the attacks of the local servants. He said that they were harassing him, mocking him, and saying that they would wring his neck. The Baron thought that he only had to wait a little while until the princess arrived, and then everything would change. But after driving through the lands and seeing what kind of harvest the agricultural lands yielded, he was surprised. He realized that indeed, my lady had done a lot of work while the ruler was at war. Now he understood why Kabiel had been so protective of his wife that day. She had given new life to these lands. But still, the Baron himself did not lose hope that his granddaughter could melt the Duke's heart. But at this stage, he may be inclined to take my lady's side until further actions are clear. Meanwhile, another riot was brewing in the kitchen of the estate. The servants were determined to defeat the one who was trying to extract all the information from them. The girls armed themselves with rolling pins and other materials to make themselves look more menacing. Marie gave instructions that there was no need to be afraid of the enemy, that together they were definitely a strong team. The other two maids were quite frightened, but Marie insisted that the battle was lost, not the entire war, and that the fact that the enemy had escaped last time did not mean that it would always be like this. But she herself was very tense. She felt that something was wrong. Elodie was busy reading the documents, but when she looked up, she was pleasantly surprised. The husband entered the office with a plush toy and reminded the girl that she loved everything soft and gentle. He hugged the toy and asked if it made him fluffier for her. Elodie laughed very cheerfully. She was pleasantly surprised by Kabiel's behavior. But suddenly, the young man's face changed a little. He became gloomy, the smile disappeared somewhere, and his hands clenched into fists, as if he was preparing to attack. And in front of him, his furry friend Ifrit appeared. But he was not at all happy to see him. They started arguing about something. Kabiel tried his best to drive him away, but he was not going to leave. The spirit headed towards Elodie, but the man immediately grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and did not let him move. At that moment, Elodie came up and asked who her husband was hiding. She took the fluffy, cute little animal into her arms and looked for a long time into its small, cunning eyes. The animal introduced itself and said that it had long wanted to see the one who saved it. The girl looked at him carefully and understood that it was she who activated that artifact before the war. But the spirit asked how she was able to save him. The girl understood that no one would believe her story and decided to remain silent. She simply spread her hands, and Kabiel whispered for the spirit to leave as quickly as possible. The little animal was offended, and although it was small in appearance, proudly headed towards the exit. Left alone again, Kabiel wanted to invite his wife to go for a walk. But then a maid distracted them and asked if they needed anything. But they let her go. They remained chatting about something, and the maid, leaving the room, was upset that the idol would soon collapse when the princess arrived. Elodie's expression also changed a little. She was already tired of the uncertainty and rumors at court. She remembered one of the maids saying that many were whispering that changes were coming soon. The girl briefly expressed her thoughts, but decided that she needed to address these issues later. And then she turned to her husband and asked if his offer to go for a walk still stood. She froze for a moment, thinking that he would answer that he had things to do. But Kabiel happily repeated his offer, and together they left the stuffy office. Meanwhile, in the training section of the estate, Heinz was deep in thought about the recent events, where Milady had behaved very strangely. He thought that she might well have resorted to magic to keep the young ruler close to her, but then his thoughts turned to other knights who did not fight with them, but considered themselves heroes. They laughed and discussed how they spent their time while the war was going on. But Heinz knew that they hadn't done anything heroic. They had only scared off a couple of monsters and patrolled the streets. He listened to their stories and was filled with anger. He didn't like empty talk, because he and the other knights were risking their lives on the battlefield. They were shackled and exposed to the most dangerous situations, and might not return at all. And this bunch of idlers were discussing some scratches. And then Heinz couldn't resist. He approached one of the soldiers and said that everything would change as soon as the princess arrived here. This dialogue was heard by other knights. They did not like this turn of events. They lived under the current duchess. He continued that the current lady was only replacing the ruler while he was at war. But then one of the guys hit Heinz with a powerful blow to the face. He couldn't help but respond in kind. He simply couldn't stand it, even though he understood that he was doing the wrong thing. At that moment, the commander of the knightly clan, Sir Bedos, entered and ordered the fight to be stopped immediately. Calling the soldiers to him, he asked what the reason for the fistfight was. Hearing the reason, he became even more angry. Then he added that it was not a knightly matter to discuss with whom their ruler should be. He shouted that no one had the right to discuss such things and defile the lady. But Heinz was still set in his ways and expressed his opinion that he considered the princess a more suitable candidate. At that moment, Sir Bedos ran his hand over Heinz's cheek and said that he needed some fresh air. He himself also saw that the ruler had changed, and he was now completely different than he had been during the war. But it was not for him to decide who was more suitable. And Heinz stood there, confused, full of thoughts, but no longer daring to express them out loud. Meanwhile, Elodie and Kabiel, while walking, decided to stop by on business and pick up some documents. The head of the trade guild was not at her place, and she wondered why this situation had happened with the letters that had not arrived. Kabiel asked what was upsetting his wife, but she did not want to share her thoughts with him. They decided to take a stroll through the streets and turned right in the direction where young Kabiel got lost. She asked if he remembered this place. He immediately answered that, of course he did. He was very scared then. She looked at her husband silently and realized that he was still that little boy inside. And he was somehow confused, because he again felt that Elodie didn't need him. But then she ruffled his hair and said that she had punished his offenders from the orphanage. He was surprised, but she said with a smile that she did it with pleasure for him. Some time later, they returned to the estate. Busy with her work, Elodie hadn't drunk her medicinal tea for a long time, but today she decided to drink it again. There were no servants. No one interfered. But after drinking, she didn't feel anything, no improvement. But suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and this made her angry. The servant came in, apologized, and said that she needed to look at the appetizers for the upcoming dinner. When she went outside, Elodie was surprised that there was no one there, and she did not understand how the maid had left so quickly. But at that moment, she began to have a severe coughing fit. She became very scared and leaned against a tree. When she looked up, she realized that she was not alone. She greeted him and asked how she could address the noble knight. He bowed his head guiltily and said that his name was Heinz. She dabbed her mouth with a handkerchief and lowered her eyes, as if she felt guilty. Elodie began to look around warily to make sure that there was no one else nearby. Heinz asked if the siren's tears were tormenting the lady, but she looked warily at the knight. Siren's tears is a disease that has been described in books, but its treatment has never been studied. Heinz had a negative attitude towards the Duchess, but for some reason, this time he did not feel contempt. She asked me to tell no one anything and to keep this meeting a secret. If possible, do not mention at all that you saw her and her illness. The knight of course agreed, but he said that one could accept help if it was offered, rather than refuse it. But Elodie just looked at him silently and made it clear that she did not want to accept help at the moment. Heinz was left alone and thought to himself that he had gone out to freshen up and had witnessed this situation. But he remembered his sister, who did not have time to do anything because of her illness, because it was too late. Meanwhile, Kabiel felt unwell and lay in bed with a compress on his forehead. The upset lady stood over her husband and did not know how to help him. She touched his forehead with concern and said that he didn't have a fever, but perhaps something else was bothering him. If we go back some time earlier, Ifrit taught Kabiel that he needed to change his approach to rapprochement. They communicated that they needed to not just observe, but change tactics in order to win the lady over. The spirit invited the guy to show himself as a new, strong person, despite the fact that she liked everything tender. And now Kabiel was lying in bed, in his pajamas, in order to somehow attract attention to himself. He sat down on the bed, unbuttoned his shirt, and wanted his wife to see his masculine body. But instead of admiration, my lady was very touched. She paid attention to the wounds that were on the body. She moved closer to Kabiel and asked why he didn't turn to the temple's magic to heal these scars. He clenched his fists and said that he didn't want to show it, because these were wounds he received in the orphanage. Elodie hugged her husband's hands with her own. She understood his pain and that he no longer wanted to appear weak. But he also put his hand on her cheek and asked her not to be upset. He is no longer in pain, and what she sees are just scars that do not affect anything. But then Elodie remembered that he was feeling unwell and asked how else she could help him. He laughed loudly and said that nothing hurt and he was just pretending. She laughed too and didn't realize that it was just a joke. And then she asked if he did the same when communicating with the princess. But Kabiel asked her not to talk about the princess anymore. He didn't want to. Elodie wondered why Kabiel said that. Either he simply didn't want to discuss the princess with her, or he didn't want to talk about her at all. These questions worried Milady no less than how he would treat the princess upon her arrival. But there were knights nearby, and they were discussing very heatedly. The maid said that she did not like these conversations, that they often talked too much about the princess. She said that she felt some kind of hostility towards these particular knights, but then they changed the conversation to the fact that the pregnant maid really wanted peaches. Elodie thought that this fruit is so popular that she would like to be able to grow it herself. But suddenly, the maid asked if the mistress knew the legend about the magician. She told that once upon a time, there lived a magician named Panetius, and he wanted to share his magic, giving part of it to the spirits and transferring part of it to the fruits. So, since that time, there has been a belief that the peach is that magical fruit, the fruit of the spirit. But suddenly, the maid fell silent at this point. Sir Bedos met them and greeted them. Elodie asked how he was feeling, and how he was resting after the difficult combat operations. Bedos was quite brief and calm. After a short conversation, the girl moved on, and he took his leave. A little later, Kabiel came to his wife and was somehow in a rather unfriendly mood. But she asked him to help her sort out the boxes and papers. He didn't really express a desire, but it gave him the opportunity to be near his wife. He helped and then watched as his wife went about her business. She was very focused and worked carefully with the test tubes. Kabiel watched her every action very closely, but then he asked why it was so important for her to do this, to study all these infusions and medicines. She could have found something more interesting and less labor-intensive to do. But Elodie said that this is precisely what interests her. She herself learns a lot of useful things and does the same. She lightly ruffled her husband's hair. Sometimes it seemed to her that he remained that child and had not grown up. But she again wanted to continue the conversation about the princess. But something stopped her. She looked at her husband, such a dear person, and kept waiting for the time to come to separate. After all, Emperor Heklos was known as a powerful man, and he had great plans for Kabiel after his victory. But the prince, who was never found after the end of the war, could make his presence known. The princess was considered the emperor's niece, and they were on very close terms. And then the time came when the princess appeared at the estate. Elodie and Kabiel, as hosts of the house, are obliged to welcome the guest. But the man made it clear with his whole appearance that he was not happy about this. The lady was upset. She saw that the princess was quite beautiful. The princess came closer. She wanted to get a better look at the gentleman. For a moment, their eyes met, and it seemed as if a spark had passed them by. At that moment, Elodie thought that the hour had come when she would hand over her husband to his new wife and mistress of the estate. They started chatting about how the princess had arrived and whether everything was okay, but only Kabiel felt left out. But then their conversation was interrupted by the maid, who apologized and said that she was ready to work. The princess was alarmed by the girl's appearance. She decided that the servants were being treated quite poorly. The girl had very sad eyes, and she was not very talkative. The princess tried to ask directly whether the maid was being bullied or what was causing her condition. After some time, to distract herself from bad thoughts such as divorce, Elodie tried to work. The maid noticed this state and came to ask, but Elodie did not react in any way. The maid was depressed by such behavior and suggested that her mistress take a walk. She went outside and decided to visit her greenhouse, where she had not been for a long time. There were a lot of different herbs there, much more than before. But then Infrit descended to her from nowhere, and Elodie was surprised. He greeted his savior, but also noticed that she was not in a good mood. She wanted to tell her what was tormenting her, but the girl understood that it was the spirit of her husband and how he could help. But sad thoughts filled her so much that her eyes betrayed sadness and pain. But just as Elodie wanted to share her experiences, she suddenly heard her husband's voice behind her. He angrily asked what was going on. He didn't like the fact that his furry friend was hanging around his wife. He came up and drove away the spirit, as if it could tell him some secrets. But after staying with Elodie, he immediately changed and became gentle and affectionate. She looked at him and suggested that they return to the estate. Kabiel agreed, and she immediately headed for the exit, and he was again left in confusion. His wife would let him get closer, then move away again, and he didn't know what to do. She continued to walk away. He looked at her. At this time, somewhere in the garden, the maid noticed something interesting. The princess and her assistant, who had arrived at the estate, decided to take a walk in the garden. And a few days before that, the maids had another conversation in the kitchen, their secret society. Elodie helped one of the maids when she went to settle into the estate. Elodie was kind enough and did not try to sympathize and help everyone as much as possible. And so the three of them reached the garden, where pink roses were blooming. The scent was so strong that the girls couldn't help but lean closer. They started picking roses, and at that moment, Iris came up with her maid. She started shouting that they had no right to pick roses in the garden. The princess did not understand what caused such angry behavior of the young lady. Her maid carefully whispered in her ear who this girl was, and that she was invited to the estate. Iris came closer to say hello, but she snatched the plucked flowers from the maid's hands and angrily said that no one gave her the right to cruelly pick them. The Harrow's granddaughter loved these pink flowers herself, but she just wouldn't let anyone pick them. She said that in this garden no one picks flowers. You can just smell them and nothing more. The princess's maid also did not understand who was in front of her and why this girl was behaving this way. The maid began to seriously conflict, and with every word she became angrier and angrier. As a result, the princess was forced to leave to avoid conflict, and Iris remained to admire the flowers. Her maid said that the princess's maid's behavior was very strange and inappropriate. Meanwhile, in his office, Kabiel was writing some documents. At that moment, Infrit appeared to him, and he was in a bad mood. He scolded Kabiel for his behavior and for constantly sending him away. I asked him why he was behaving this way, because during the war, they were a well-coordinated team. Kabiel said that he is tormented by his wife's incomprehensible behavior. He does not understand many of her words, and that she has become colder. He looked out of his office window, but his thoughts seemed to be somewhere else. He saw his wife's greenhouse and even noticed that she spent more time there than with him. And at this time, the lady received those long-awaited peaches. She was very pleased. Maybe at least some fruit could lift her spirits. Negotiations with the supplier were successful. Next time, they delivered a much larger quantity. She returned back with her maid, and they had a pleasant conversation. But suddenly, the two of them were stopped by some noisy conversation nearby. There was a group of knights and Princess Larissa talking there. They were discussing something very heatedly and laughing loudly. Elodie noticed this and felt uncomfortable that the princess had found common ground with the knights so quickly. The maid expressed her opinion that she did not understand why the girl was behaving this way and would soon leave. But Elodie understood that the princess, on the contrary, could stay, and therefore she was looking for those who would be with her. At this time, Larissa was changing clothes in her room. The maid adjusted her dress, and her assistant admired the girl's new outfit. But suddenly, she didn't like something, and the assistant pushed the maid to the floor with all her strength. Larissa yelled at the girl and added that she had been behaving inappropriately lately. The princess helped the maid to get up and asked if she had missed her clothes. But when she offered her hand, I noticed that there was a bruise on her hand, and it was not very fresh. Larissa asked where the injury came from and made it clear that the girl could share if something was wrong. But hearing nothing, the princess began to think that the rumors of cruel treatment in this estate were not just rumors. The princess said that Olivia should not be afraid, and if she is offended, she can share. Carolina looked at all this rather distrustfully. She began to tell the princess that rumors do not arise out of thin air, and she needed to be more careful. Caroline was partly right, because according to the novel, the Duchess was indeed cunning. But now the reality is not quite the same. She talked about her poisons in many places, and for a long time, even after she died in the book. This fact alarmed the princess, and she began to think that in such a case, she too might be in danger. But then Caroline switched her thoughts to the fact that she needed a hairstyle to meet the Duke. The girls agreed that the most appropriate thing would be to tie the braid together. And so, sometime later, the girls stood in a huge hall at a dinner in honor of her arrival at the estate. The knights welcomed the guest, but Heinz was wary. Elodie and Kabiel were sitting at a separate table, and the girl happily raised her glass as a sign of respect to the guest. The atmosphere was pleasant. Music was playing, and guests were chatting. Elodie watched as the princess quickly found common ground with the knights. She laughed, and it was clear that it was sincere, and the knights were also interested in the conversation. The Duchess watched these moments with caution. She understood that this was most likely exactly the time she had read so much about in the novel. But then suddenly, Kabiel leaned towards her and began to whisper in her ear that he wanted to talk to her. She was surprised. He spoke somehow mysteriously and incomprehensibly. But Kabiel looked at his wife seriously. He was not joking, and was in the mood for a serious conversation after the banquet. But he continued to hold the Duchess's hand in his own. The princess also carefully observed what was happening at the table of the hosts of the house during the conversation. One of the knights said that their commander had taste and a beautiful wife. Larissa was a little upset and said out loud, as a conclusion, that she did not know that the Duke was married. But then, as always, her maid added that she had heard about this lady's boorish manners. But Heinz did not agree with this situation. He said that these were just stupid speculations. But the maid did not calm down and continued to whisper her guesses to the guys and pass on rumors. But then one knight said that he had heard that the temple was to blame for all the obstacles between spouses at the moment. At that moment, Heinz was wondering what he should do, remain silent, or tell what he knew. He caught himself thinking that he had changed his mind about the Duchess after he met her in person, and she asked him not to betray her. Meanwhile, a young man approached the Duke and said that more guests had arrived. Kabiel and Elodie hurried out into the street to greet the arriving guests. The man insisted that Elodie put on a coat, as it was quite chilly outside at night. And then people in white and gold clothes greeted them. These were representatives of the Tizer Temple. Elodie greeted them and welcomed them as the hostess of the house. Their eyes met, but the priest acted somehow worried. A little later, he pointed to the cart and apologized for the fact that they had held up all these supplies during the war. Kabiel was unhappy with this state of affairs. He was angry and could not contain it. He immediately expressed his indignation. The priest accepted his words, and then he presented a gift for Elodie, with the same apologies for the loss of communication between him and her husband. When the girl opened the box, there was a magic mirror for long-distance communication. She was delighted and said that she was grateful for such a luxurious gift. But that was not all. Another priest handed her another box. She was even more surprised and couldn't even imagine what it would be. When she opened it, she found all the letters she had written over the course of 7 years. The priests were asked to retire to their quarters and rest after the long journey. Kabiel, full of anger, watched these carts and the priests themselves. His eyes seemed to be bloodshot with hatred. But then his wife called out to him. She said that even though it was late, he would like to read all these letters. He changed his anger to mercy and even became a little confused. Kabiel reached out his hands for the box of letters and leaned over to kiss his wife. Still, having taken this box, when he opened it, he was amazed that it was full of letters. He immediately said that he was ready to kill all these priests right now. But Elodie immediately said that this would be a huge mistake on his part and would tarnish his reputation. To distract him from bad thoughts, she asked him to hug her. Kabiel did this with great joy, without a moment's hesitation. At that moment, the servant returned. Delicately making it clear that she was already there, she coughed. She asked what to do with the banquet, since the priests said that they would rest today. Elodie said that she would decide everything herself, and the rest could go free, and hurried away. But all this time she felt awkward and couldn't understand why. Meanwhile, all the supplies were unloaded in the corridor of the estate. The knights, seeing such a number of boxes and crates, decided that these were gifts from the temple. But someone from the crowd said that these were supplies that the lady herself had sent them. They began to discuss heatedly and make their own guesses, and behind them stood the maid, clenching her fists. But then she said that this was all due to their duchess, and they did not appreciate it. The knights thought, stood silently, and simply scratched their heads. And the maid continued to say that for all these 7 years, the mistress did not sleep nights to provide you with what you needed, and she was deceived. And then the maid pointed her hand right in the face of one of the knights and added that they had no right to even pronounce her name. As she was leaving, the girl noticed that Heinz was kneeling and crying. And the next day, somewhere in the Duke's office, Kabiel sat in a chair and reread all the letters that he had never received on time during the war. He was imbued with every line, and his opinion about his wife completely changed. After reading everything, Kabiel wanted to go to his wife, but something stopped him. He cried over the letters and realized that his face was very swollen, and he did not want his wife to see him like that. Meanwhile, the priest Amos watched from the window of his room the events taking place in the courtyard of the estate. At this time, Elodie was making her plans in her room. Amos was talking to himself. He was upset and puzzled about something. Meanwhile, Caroline and the princess discussed rumors about the duchess and the possibility of visiting the flower greenhouse. The princess really wanted to look at the roses again, but after the last incident, she didn't know how. Caroline reminded her that Iris, who hadn't allowed her to even get close to the flowers last time, might do the same again. This moment saddened Larissa. She really hoped, if not to collect. Elodie shared her plans with her maid that she would now conduct an experiment. She wanted to make some adjustments to the communication device the monks had given her. The maid was very happy when the duchess was immersed in her affairs and not upset by anything. But suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and she hurried to go see who was there. On the threshold was the princess and the servants who obeyed her. The duchess's maid was not too happy to see them, and therefore did not immediately want to let them into the room. But then the duchess herself came up and asked what had happened since they had come to her. In response, she heard the princess's desire to visit the greenhouse, which was closed to visitors. Elodie agreed to accompany the girls and keep them company. Carolina and Larissa admired every flower they saw in front of them at every step. But the princess was most surprised when she saw the Aperia flower bush. She almost burst into tears. The duchess couldn't help but ask what had upset the girl so much, and she immediately said that she thought she would never see those flowers again. The duchess plucked one flower without hesitation. She handed it to Larissa with the words, as a sign of introduction, "Let it be with you." The princess was very happy and thanked the duchess for such a valuable gift. While the girls were chatting, Ifrit quietly appeared and said that evil dogs were roaming the estate, and the princess never ceased to admire the greenhouse and its plants. A little later, they walked into the Duchess's laboratory, and the girl immediately approached the table where papers were scattered. She noticed a gift from the temple, which was lying carelessly, and a stack of notes. But then her maid screamed that she had been hit by an unknown poison. She screamed to be saved. But when the Duchess came and looked into it, she said it was just water. They stood for a moment and looked at each other, the princess and the maid distrustfully, and Elodie at a loss. Caroline began to whisper that there were various rumors about the Duchess, including about her abilities. Laris became wary, and her curiosity was aroused even more after the maid's words. She approached the table and wanted to take one of the papers that were lying on the table to read. But at that moment, the maid Olivia took the princess by the hand and said that she had no right to touch the papers. But at that moment, Caroline ran up and forcefully pushed the maid away from the princess. She immediately tried to swing and strike. But it was at that moment that Elodie grabbed Caroline's hand and stopped her actions. She looked at the maid with a menacing, downright threatening look. She did not like this treatment of either the princess or herself, but she hastened to pull her hand back. The princess hastened to apologize for the actions of her maid. Elodie said that Caroline's behavior here was inappropriate and unacceptable. The maid began to say that the girl had grabbed the princess, and this was unacceptable, and she had to be punished. Olivia argued and said that she didn't grab them, but simply asked them to take their hands off the documents. The gazes of the lady and the princess met, and there was anger in each one's gaze. Elodie ordered Olivia to be taken to the estate for now, and released her from work for the next few days. And then the conversation between the girls continued, but in a slightly calmer atmosphere. The princess said that since the girl reacted in such a way that the documents were touched, it meant the Duchess had something to hide. The Duchess responded by saying that these were her personal notes from observations and research. She handed the notes to the princess to make sure that no one was trying to hide anything. The girl read it with a guilty look. The notes really didn't contain any suspicious information. The Duchess sighed and said softly to herself that if the princess stayed, it would be difficult for everyone. Her methods towards the servants are very strange and evil. It is unlikely that she will be accepted and understood. Giving back the notes, the princess asked if the Duchess could teach her the old way of writing. Elodie asked if the princess had ever used her mana. She replied that she had never used it before, but she wasn't even sure that she had it. Representatives of the temple possess this magnificently, and it is also possible for people who have inner mana. Otherwise, it is quite difficult to learn this, and practically impossible in pairs. Larissa asked if the Duke had such a skill, and Elodie nodded in response. Caroline immediately whispered to her princess that she could turn to the Duke, and at the same time, there would be a topic for conversation. Elodie looked at the whole situation, as if she had refused to teach, since she had simply explained what was what. The princess and her maid decided to leave, as they considered themselves superfluous there. Elodie found this situation strange. She didn't understand why they decided to make her the one to blame. Larissa, on the contrary, felt at home here. She liked this house and the atmosphere inside. She felt safe and like she was at home for the first time in years. And the main reason for being here was the Duke, with whom she never managed to communicate much. She told herself that she had no plans to leave here, at least not as soon as most people here thought. Meanwhile, Heinz was lying on the bed, lost in his thoughts. She kept thinking about the Duchess, and tears came to her eyes. He had a completely different opinion of her before that meeting. He considered her rude and evil. He got out of bed and talked to himself that after the truth about the temple became clear, he changed his mind. Heinz actually began to think that Elodie and Kabiel were a perfect match. The next day, the priest came to the lady with a very interesting question. This alarmed and surprised Elodie very much. She was a little confused. He asked to show him the communication device that had been given to her during her visit. He had heard that the girl had allegedly broken him. This information needed to be verified. Elodie readily agreed to do what was required of her. The priest examined the gift and was very surprised when he did not find what was stated. He closed the box, said there had been a mistake, and apologized for the inconvenience. He felt awkward. His facial expression changed greatly, and he hurried away. Count de Four, who arrived at the estate with the princess, was to blame for everything, and Elodie couldn't understand what was happening. She was overcome with panic. Yesterday, the princess came to her and tried to catch her in concealing information. now the priest. The high priest, on the contrary, was very angry that he believed the rumors, and he had to justify himself to the Duchess. Princess Larissa returned the lost relic to the temple, but that's no reason to trust her every word. The Duke himself and his power were much more important to them, and now everything could really be lost. The fact that the temple had interfered in the Duchess's affairs could now further alienate the Duke from the temple. It is much more profitable for them to recognize the Duchess. She also has innate strength. At this time, Priest Theodore was walking down the corridor, immersed in his thoughts. Elder Amos nearly knocked him off his feet as he rushed past like a fury. Theodore was surprised by the elder's behavior, but after chatting something to him as he walked, he remained in his place. And the Duchess, still thinking about how she was suspected of intrigues that were incomprehensible to her, left the room. Not noticing the priest in front of her, she ran straight into him. He gently hugged her shoulders and asked if she was hurt, but she was immediately taken aback by the surprise. But after a while, she calmed down and apologized for behaving awkwardly and almost knocking the guest down. Theodore said that he had wanted to talk for a long time and was looking for a reason to meet, but if the Duchess was not feeling well, he would wait. The Duchess took the priest by the hand and said that she needed to leave on important business. He looked at his hand, which the girl had touched. Then he pressed her to himself and stood motionless for several minutes, as if something magical had touched him. The priest first learned of Milady when he was assigned to monitor all the documents she sent to the Duke. At first he treated it as a normal job, without much thought, and then the letters started coming more and more frequently, and with each subsequent letter, Theodore became more and more interested in the lady who wrote these lines. He imagined her in his mind and wanted someone to speak to him so sincerely and tenderly. Deep down, he imagined that one day he would meet this girl and be able to talk to her himself. But then a rumor spread that she was cunning and evil, and he ordered all the letters to be returned. And when the war ended, a new rumor appeared that they were going to give the princess as a wife to the Duke. At this time, Kabiel continued to read the letters that never reached him during the war. He read everything and decided that he needed to urgently visit my lady to talk. Kabiel imagined how he would hand her the letters and thank her for all the warmth and tenderness that he had experienced. But then Ifrit appeared and asked the Duchess to open the greenhouse. He said that there is a lot of pure and fresh manna there, much more than what Kabiel gives. But if he doesn't ask, then Ifrit will get in himself, and the Duke will be blamed for everything. He understood perfectly well that Elodie would distance herself even more from him if she believed that he was to blame. Kabiel thought for a moment and decided with even greater certainty that they needed to talk immediately. He quickly headed towards the room where his wife now lived. On the way to his wife, the princess met him and was very happy about the chance meeting. When Kabiel asked where she was going, she replied that she was going to the Duchess, and he was surprised. He said he needed to talk to his wife face to face and asked her to come another time. Caroline had previously told the princess that the couple did not live together and slept in separate rooms. He hurried to leave, but Larissa was very persistent in her desire to talk. She really wanted to start a conversation, but due to shyness, she didn't know how to begin it. And the Duke looked at her and caught himself thinking that they were somehow similar. He looked at his wife in the same way. He realized that most likely the princess wanted a closer relationship, but he was not ready to give it to her. To clarify the situation once and for all, he abruptly said that he was not going to get divorced and that she had nothing to hope for. At that moment, Elodie passed by and noticed the Duke and princess talking, but she didn't know the essence of it. She decided that right now they could perhaps confess their feelings. They would be a beautiful couple. She began to feel sad that her time was over, and no one even warned her. It was a shame. But the Duchess also noticed that her relationship with the knights had become more complicated, and her illness intensifies during times of worry, which also frightened her that Kabiel would see her helpless. She was both ashamed and angry that she had not been able to find a solution much earlier. Elodie briefly imagined herself becoming the cruel villain she had read about in the novel. Perhaps that is why the princess is betraying her, because she fears for her life. Elodie herself was most worried about Kabiel and did not want to harm him. She decided that she would just leave. She had already packed her things, so there was nothing difficult. She left a note stating that she was going on a trip for a few days. She took a heavy suitcase with her things and went to the eastern part of the estate, where there is usually no one. But suddenly, she heard voices and hid. As she got closer, she remembered that representatives of the temple now lived in this part. But they were discussing something very animatedly, and she decided to listen to their conversation. The men said that they did not understand the whole situation, why they were waiting for orders regarding Kabiel. Elodie was upset when she heard her husband's name. The talk was that the high priest Amos could kill Kabiel if he did not like his actions. She became even more frightened, because if she was not there, then no one would be able to help the Duke. Everyone here was against him. But at their first meeting, they described their arrival completely differently. But Kabiel is also a master of the sword, possesses strong internal energy, and cannot be killed so easily. The only ones higher than him can be the high priest or the master of the Tower of Magicians. And then the Duchess remembered that she had heard something similar discussed before. Meanwhile, the rest of the Holy Knights were discussing their good work with their elder. He thanked Theodore for a job well done and said that he could go and rest in peace. Theodore was about to head to his room, but something alerted him and he listened. He approached the arch and saw the Duchess standing there, confused. He politely asked her what she was doing there at such a late hour. She quickly replied that before going to bed, she decided to take a walk and get some air. She apologized and said that she already wanted to leave. But suddenly, the priest asked why she was walking with a suitcase in her hands. She didn't know what to answer and hurried to leave as quickly as possible. But Theodore tried to stop her. He had not lost hope of talking to her since his arrival. He grabbed her hand and asked her not to leave. At least not so quickly. Elodie didn't like these actions and asked to explain what was going on. He apologized and said that he didn't mean to offend, but he just wanted to chat. She didn't understand what they could be chatting about, and she was still haunted by thoughts of what she had heard just recently. But suddenly, in the silence, someone else's footsteps were heard. It was Kabiel, and he was terribly angry. A little earlier, he came to Elodie's bedroom, but no one opened the door for him. He didn't quite understand where his wife could be at such a time, and where she could have gone. But suddenly, Ifrit opened the door for him, which surprised the Duke greatly. He said that he had been sitting in her room for a long time, and she had not been there for a long time, only a note on the table. After reading the note, the Duke became even more confused. He did not understand what kind of journey she was planning. And so, after some time, he stood where she was talking, since Ifrit can show the location of people. Without thinking, he slapped Theodore, because from the very first day the priests appeared here, he had been angry. Elodie asked her husband to calm down. She was worried about how all this could affect him. The Duke commanded Elodie to follow him into the room. Kabiel pushed the priest aside and repeated once again that they needed to talk in private. The girl apologized to the priest for her husband and said that it would not be possible to talk. He noticed that they had a rather strange relationship. Perhaps there were feelings, but not the same ones. Kabiel and Elodie walked quickly along the corridor of the estate, silently. But suddenly, the Duke pulled my lady by the hand. She didn't notice how he lightly picked her up in his arms along with the suitcase. And now they were already in the room. He was angry. He didn't understand what feeling he had inside. Elodie immediately asked what was happening to her husband, why he was so aggressive. She felt guilty about what happened and began to apologize. Kabiel looked at his wife with a rather insolent gaze. He did not like the events of the last few days. But then, with childish naivety, he asked if she was having an affair. He started a dialogue and asked why she was going somewhere with a suitcase. Why is she so cold to him all these days? What is going on between them if they are husband and wife? She took his hands and gently told him that she had wanted to tell him for a long time and really wanted to leave the estate. But now she has completely different plans. She has learned so much that she cannot betray him. He immediately hugged her tightly and did not let go for a long time, saying that he loved her. The only question that worried him was what kind of relationship she had with the priest, Theodore. The girl replied that she had never had any relationship with him. What he saw was just a random misunderstanding, and they had not agreed to meet. Elodie was surprised by this behavior and didn't know how to react. Kabiel burst into tears when he heard that his wife had been devoted to him all this time. She was the only person who gave him warmth and care after the orphanage. He hugged her gently by the shoulders. Elodie asked how he could divorce her, since he should be with the princess. And at that moment, Kabiel leaned sharply over Elodie and said that he loved only her and did not need anyone else. And this meant that the story in the novel was now going completely differently, and it was unclear how to behave. Kabiel became upset and hurried out into the corridor. He sat down on the floor as if unconscious. At this time, a maid was walking down the corridor. She was surprised. She approached him in a friendly manner and asked if the Duke needed help, or if he could call someone. But Kabiel stood up abruptly, muttered something, and left. Meanwhile, Caroline came running with the news that the Duke was coming to talk to her. She immediately said that she needed to tidy herself up a bit and put her hair up. Meanwhile, somewhere in the chambers of Count de Pere, something interesting was about to happen. The princess also came here and was very puzzled that the Count was here, but was quite angry. She said without delay that the princess should return to her imperial palace. The carriages were immediately assembled, and the princess and her retinue immediately left the Cernoa estate. Caroline, seeing the princess's very depressed state, asked her what had happened. She tried to convey the conversation that took place in the room of the Count and the Duke. Everyone was on edge. Larissa didn't understand what she had done, or what she had done wrong, that she was being kicked out of the estate. But the Duke did not consider it necessary to go into details. He simply said his word, and it did not require explanation. The princess cried, because she had such hopes for a beautiful, bright future. After her estate was destroyed by the war and her parents were gone, she had no reason to live. And then she found herself in the luxurious Cernoa mansion, with its cozy atmosphere and greenhouses with flowers, friendly staff and caring knights who showed her attention. And now, for some unknown reason, she is being kicked out of the house that was supposed to be hers. Caroline listened to all this. It was painful for her to see the princess in such a state. The carriage moved away from the beautiful place, and the princess watched the views from the carriage window with great regret. Count de Pere was angry because the Duke had disobeyed the Emperor's order, and he would have to be punished for it. At the same time, the temple representatives also left the estate. Earlier, Kabiel had summoned the High Priest Amos and told him that one of his subordinates had treated Milady badly. Amos looked at Theodore and said that upon arrival at the temple, he would definitely figure out how true the accusations were. Theodore looked at the High Priest with a grin. He had nothing to say. Milady drank her herbal infusion and felt somehow quite calm. But then she started having a coughing fit, and the maid who was nearby became worried. But Elodie said there was nothing to worry about. It would all pass soon, but she calmly asked. For some reason, it became somehow quiet, and all the guests who were there were not visible. She was a little worried and began to speculate about what could have happened. But when she heard the maid's answer, that the Duke had asked everyone to leave, she became angry. She immediately hurried to visit the Duke and have a serious talk with him. She first asked why there were no guests and whether she was the reason that everyone left so soon. Milady was also worried about the fact that the Duke had to marry the princess, but he did not want to do it. Kabiel sat motionless, as if the conversation was not about him at that moment. The girl asked again why he had sent the princess. It wasn't because of that quarrel with Theodore that the priests had left. Now the whole story of the novel was changing. Either she or Kabiel himself changed the course of history. But she also understood that if the Duke did not want it, she would not be able to force them to marry. And he still treats her with the same reverence, not as a sister who raised him, but as a girl. He was only smiling and nice with her, but the rest of the time he walked around gloomy and dissatisfied. She bashfully asked if he considered her his sister, as he had known her since childhood. He laughed and said that such feelings are not shown towards a sister. She was mistaken. Elodie truly realized that she was wrong, and all this time, she was trying to convince herself not to love. But Kabiel said that if she insisted, he could bring the princess back and marry her if it would be better for her. Elodie herself didn't know how things would be better for her, because everything was out of control. Kabiel looked at Milady again like a little child with some hope in his eyes. She no longer knew what to expect, what to say. She felt helpless, but the Duke was so nice that it was impossible to refuse him any request. She looked down and said that she would try to somehow accept the current situation. The Duke was pleased with the outcome of the conversation. He mentally hugged his wife as before, and was sure that nothing more threatened them. But he disobeyed the Emperor's order, and there was a possibility that he could be punished. But then my lady asked him how much strength he had, and he shouted that it was enough to protect her, but she knew it wasn't her fault. She remembered the words of the Holy Knights, and her husband was in danger. And after the war, the Emperor said nothing more about the young ruler. All these latest events and new actions led Milady herself to a dead end. Meanwhile, all the maids were busy cleaning the estate after the guests had left. But besides the clean stairs, they were worried about the condition of Milady herself. At this point in the discussion, a dejected Heinz came up and said that she had Siren's disease. He quickly left, and the girls decided that he was in love with their mistress. But he just wanted someone to help her, because she herself could not and did not want to talk about her illness. The girls were even more puzzled after this information. Meanwhile, my lady was studying documents in her laboratory. She wanted to understand a lot, to study, to complete what she had started, so that the lands would prosper. But the abundance of information made her head spin, and she worried that it was the illness making itself known. Seeing the state, the servants came up, but my lady said that everything was fine. The Duchess was concerned about the fact that the first descendant of Cernoa had not completely conquered the lands, and now we need to understand how to invest money so that it works for the good. She remembered that she had started this topic during the war, but had abandoned it due to certain circumstances. Now she thought that something simple, but very necessary, was needed to have circulation. She came up with an interesting idea to make medicines that would be needed by everyone. Lost in her thoughts, she heard a knock on the door and in a drawling voice said, "Come in." Heinz appeared on the threshold, but his face looked somehow exhausted. Milady immediately asked what exactly brought him to her, but without saying a word, he immediately fell to his knees in front of her, and she realized something had happened. Heinz immediately began to apologize, and then said that he could not keep the secret she entrusted to him.